I'd like to welcome everybody to this evening's webinar. This evening we'll be talking about core mechanics for the baseball swing. We're going to do an overview of the concepts of creating a training program first. We'll follow that by the anatomy of functional core mechanics. We will then discuss, in an overview fashion, the biomechanics of core mechanics or baseball torso mechanics. And then we'll get into some basic progressive skills training that can be utilized as a function of training athletes to utilize their core or their torso more effectively in the overall swing sequence. So we'll go ahead and we'll get started here with a basic overview of what we're going to essentially talk about this evening. Just as a quick overview, we're going to talk about creating these programs. So when we want to create a functional movement or skill-specific sort of functional program, we want to focus on a few key areas. Our goals for the program, the structure that we want to use, and the overall progression for getting to where we want to get with the athlete. So we're going to talk just in overview fashion, but we're going to talk a little bit about how that all kind of comes together. We're then going to talk about, as I suggested, the core and torso mechanics, both from an anatomical / functional perspective, as well as a swing biomechanics perspective. And then we'll talk a little bit about the structure and perspective in creating a core-specific functional movement training program. And then we'll talk about a couple different variations of functional training program and ways to sort of implement these concepts in an effective, useful, but actually fairly simple way. So as a quick overview, when we're looking at developing a activity-specific sort of functional training program, if you will, there are some key elements to creating an effective program. The number one thing is having a goal. In other words, some sort of clear-cut, definable reason for training. And essentially how we create the goal is by evaluating the athlete, and there are many different ways that this can be done. It can be done in a more complex way using 3D biomechanics. It can be done in a more simplistic way using just 2D video, and it can be even done in a more simplistic way by just visually assessing an athlete. But there has to be some sort of evaluation process. From that evaluation, or from the data that is collected during that evaluation process, there has to be some sort of systematic analysis of that data. Again, it can be as simple as watching a hitter and as advanced as collecting 6-degree of freedom 3-dimensional data, but we have to have some way to analyze the data that has been collected. From that analysis, we have to be able to define some sort of issue, some sort of problem, some sort of breakdown in the functional biomechanics and functional movement of the athletic endeavor, in this case being the baseball swing. And from that, we have to have or have to create a definable outcome, and that becomes our goal. So it's really important when you start along this process to be able to evaluate the athlete, analyze the data, define the issues that the athlete has with respect to functional performance, and then define some sort of outcome or goal for your training program. That's absolutely crucial. Once we've created or defined the goal, we then have to have some sort of structure. That structure is important. How do we get from point A to point B? There has to be a plan. We have an athlete that has certain specific functional breakdown in his swing mechanism. We have assessed that. We now have to say we want to get that athlete from this point with these specific characteristics to this point with advanced characteristics or improved performance characteristics. So we have to have a plan. The plan doesn't have to be rigid. It can be fluid, but there has to be a rhyme and a reason for what you're doing. So that structure is as important as the goal. They both go hand in hand. Once we've defined a goal and we have some structure, how we're going to get from plan A or point A to point B, we have to have in there some sort of progression, especially when you're talking about, and this is true of almost all programs, but especially when you're talking about skill development. There has to be a progression. So one of the ways we can think about this is that we want to start the athlete with small digestible parts We want to add those parts together for more complex movement, and then add speed, and then add power, and then add some of the sort of the key outcome characteristics. But before we get to those outcome characteristics, the speed and power, we need to have a solid movement pattern, not a perfect movement pattern, but a solid movement pattern. This movement pattern has to be to a point where speed, power, some of these outcome characteristics aren't going to be laid on top of bad movement, bad foundation. And as a function of that, the training has to include some sort of systematic escalation or increase in the challenges and demands. So not only are we starting with small units of movement that can be easily identified and easily trained and then linked together, but as a function of that, we want to increase or escalate the challenge of the program so that the nervous system is being continuously challenged. And now we're not going to get into the details of this, and this can be a whole lecture series in and of itself, probably multiple layers of lecture series. But the idea here is that whether you're doing a more linear block type of progression when you begin, or you're doing more randomized kind of training, there has to be these components, and they're very important as a function of stimulating the nervous system and getting the response, the learning response, and the retention response that we want with respect to improved movement and improved functional pattern. Okay, so let's get into the anatomy of the torso. Not in any great detail here, but let's get into the anatomy of what it is that we're talking about with respect to core movement. So the key here, and we're going to get into this a little bit more specifically in the swing mechanics part of this, but the musculature of the core is designed for both stability as well as mobility. And so when we look at this from an anatomical perspective, certain groups of muscles are going to be engaged in creating spine stability at a very, very kind of basic level functional movement or foundational perspective, as well as more sort of global stability with respect to creating swing patterns. So there are groups of muscles contained in the core musculature that are going to be engaged in stability. At the same time, certain muscles are engaged in stability, stabilizing both the spine as well as the torso in this 6 degree of freedom environment. Some muscles are going to be creating movement. Now let's talk a little bit more specifically about the muscles that are going to be creating the movement. What we're looking at primarily here is what we'll call, or what we refer to as our inner and outer obliques. So let's say this is a right-handed hitter, right? So the hitting motion is going this direction. We have our inner obliques on this side that are angled essentially this direction, and our outer obliques on this side. Now, of course, those aren't the only muscles that are involved in movement, and especially as you move up through mid-thoracic and into the upper torso, lats are involved, and other musculature is going to be involved, sometimes as a primary mover, sometimes as a secondary mover. But let's talk specifically about the inner oblique and the outer oblique concepts here. These are the muscles that are going to be most important in creating rotational movement along the essentially transverse plane, or perpendicular to the spine, or perpendicular to the orientation of the torso. We can consider really this chain to be almost a dynamic sling. There are some trainers that have referred to this as essentially a power sling. Jason Glass is one. I think it's a great concept to consider that these muscles sort of link together to create almost a sling to almost slingshot the upper body off of the lower body. And that's the crucial part of core dynamic. This sling not only starts on this side here at the inner out to the outer oblique across the torso, creating this sling action, so that we have an anchor on this side driving the movement here. But really, to some degree, that sling wraps around the leg and down, and really is triggered all the way down into the bottom of the foot. So we have a sling that is going to be driven from the lower body all the way up through the upper leg into the torso, and then across the torso, creating this essentially this power sling to accelerate the upper torso off of the movement and then the anchor of the lower body. So the musculature, and understanding that there are groups of muscles that are designed more, and I don't have the back picture, but the back as well as as the front, posterior as well as the anterior, you've got muscles in this zone that are predominantly utilized for stability. And then you've got muscles in these zones that are more diagonally attached, diagonally designed, that are going to be creating rotational movement, and that rotation is best affected or best produced perpendicular to the orientation of the torso or the spine. So what I like to do as we move forward is talk a little bit more specifically about the swing mechanics of this and relate it back to the anatomy. Again, this isn't an in-depth anatomical lesson, but it does give us some idea of the musculature that's involved. And really, more than the musculature directly, what we're trying to get across is that there are groups of muscles that are designed primarily for stability during these motions, and then there are muscles and musculature that are going to be designed more for the mobility part of what's going on. And as simple as it can seem when you look at the overall pattern from the outside, from an inside anatomical and biomechanical function perspective, it's a fairly complex movement when you get into the torso movement or torso mechanics, because, like I said, you have musculature that is acting to stabilize while at the same time, or hold isometrically to some degree, hold or stabilize. And then you've got muscles that at the same time that the isometric or stability components are going on are dynamically, ballistically creating very high-speed rotational movements. So it's from an anatomical, neuromechanical perspective, it's a fairly complex thing that the body is undertaking. The torso being a real critical part after we have generated force, a real critical part for essentially transitioning force into movement. So the torso is absolutely critical. It gets overused to some degree. Even still, this concept of core and core development is just one of those terminologies or whatever you want to call it that's just kind of overused and many times misused. But it is fundamental that the torso or the core really drives and facilitates turning force, which is our lower body, predominantly our lower body's role in this process, into some sort of functional movement. So the core is absolutely critical, and it's from the core that we're really deriving the bulk of our functional movement based on the more sort of finer, movement patterns. The lower body being more our brute force, although those movement patterns are also subtle and complicated and intricate. The torso by far has the more intricate job in turning brute force into effective functional pattern. So let's go ahead and let's take a look now at the swing biomechanics part of this. We talked last week about primary drivers. So in the complexity of the overall motion, there are some really key areas that we can group into really primaries. These are our primary colors, if you will. These are our primary drivers, our primary foundational movements. We talked about lower body last week. We're talking about core now. Lower body is really essentially creating force and using force to sort of facilitate the movement. The core or the torso is now converting force, in what we're really talking about linear type force, into rotational movement and rotational speed. So if you think of the lower body as essentially the horsepower, the raw force development, the raw horsepower, you're going to think of the core as the differential. So you've got all this raw horsepower, but if you don't turn the wheels, that horsepower goes to waste. So the core is really our differential turning that raw horsepower of the lower body into movement, putting wheels into motion and rubber to road. So our core is absolutely critical. We can't do much with our raw power unless we're converting it into movement, and that's our core as a part of these primary drivers. Next week we're going to talk about the upper extremity, and that is our fling movement, accelerating the arms and accelerating the back into the impact zone as a function of lower body power and core conversion. So just from a swing biomechanics perspective, let's talk about the two areas that are crucial to core movement. The first is stability. Now, you can think of stability in the more traditional terms, and that is, kind of stabilizing the spine and, the abdominal region and creating a stable environment from an anatomical perspective. And that's going on during the swing pattern. But as importantly is the more superficial characteristics, and that is essentially using the torso to create an axis of rotation for the swing dynamic. So what I've done here is I drew essentially what you might consider to be right up through the spine, but really through the center of the torso, let's consider this orientation in space. And it's that orientation that has to be stable and held in a certain dynamic to allow the lower body, the pelvic region, to rotate, and to allow the upper torso, the upper thoracic, to rotate. And we want those rotations to work as perpendicular to the spine as possible. Okay, so we're going to get into this a little bit in the next slide as well. But let's consider, we're just grossly draw a spine, right? And you can imagine all the different sets here as we move down the spine. The spine works best in facilitating rotation and stabilizing rotation when it's kept in roughly a neutral position. If we get too much bending, especially through the thoracic region, where we get a lot of torso bending that results in spine thoracic bending, now we're going to get the sets of the spine that start to get pinched down, especially through this mid-back region, where we're going to gain most of our range of motion. And the sets are going to facilitate that range of motion are now being restricted. So we want to move as perpendicular to our orientation and to the spine as possible. So the spine has to be kept in such an orientation such that body segments can work perpendicular to the plane that's being created, the axis of rotation that's being created, to facilitate the most dynamic rotational speed. So that's an important part of the swing mechanics, and that's an important part of teaching athletes functional movement pattern. And in addition to power and output and performance, it plays a huge role in minimizing the risk of overuse injury, in particular back injury, and that's depending on where you're talking about restricted thoracic movement is going to have a dramatic impact on lumbar sacral spine as well as cervical spine. So that's where you get not only mid-back issues, but you're going to get low back issues and neck issues as a result of not being able to stabilize the spine and not moving dynamically perpendicular to the orientation that's created. So that's from a swing mechanics perspective. That's one of the crucial elements that we want to talk about, and one of the crucial elements we want to analyze with our athletes when we're looking at their swing pattern as a part of creating goals and structure and progression. And it's definitely something that we need to embody in our training programs as a function of the movement that we want to improve on, or that we want to create as far as performance goes. Okay. So the next thing that we're looking at is the ability to coordinate the pelvis relative to the upper thoracic, or the pelvis relative to the upper torso. This can be referred to as core dissociation, core differentiation, but it's the ability to move the pelvis relatively independent of the upper torso and use that relationship to create a stretch response dynamic, which will facilitate a coordination whereby the lower body is engaged prior to the upper torso, creating a differential, and then the upper torso is accelerated at very high rates of speed as a function of the lower body's speed, and then the lower body's anchor utilizing the stretch response of the core musculature, that power sling that we talked about, to create rotation at the upper thoracic. And we're going to get into this a little bit more when we get into the PST components, what this really is, and then how it's best developed, and what it means to power, what it essentially means to perform. So at the same time, you have the core orientation being established by the stability components. You've got this core differentiation or differential creating power and speed through this dynamic rotational coordination pattern. So we want to instill both of those. We want to evaluate that, and then we want to instill both of those in a program for an athlete to develop more effective patterning around these concepts. Okay, before we get into the PST here, let's talk just briefly about when you're creating a program here, what it is that we want to create, what it is that we want to embody in our program. And it's obviously no surprise that the two things we want to embody are stability and differentiation. So when we're developing a program, we want to have a program that isolates as well as integrates the stability components, that creating of an axis of rotation and maintaining an axis of rotation for this power development. And then we want around that axis of rotation to be able to differentiate the pelvis in the upper thoracic or the pelvis in the upper torso to create a power differential or a power dynamic. And that includes body segments, say for example the pelvis, accelerating as well as decelerating, or being mobile as well as being stable, as a part of the sequence of events that creates this amplification of speed as we move from the lower body to the upper body. And then next week we'll talk about how as we move through the core, it's then transferred through the arms to the bat itself. So today what we want to talk about are programs that will embody stability or posture and the maintenance of an axis of rotation for the swing dynamic, as well as differentiation or core differential, where we're using force, raw horsepower, to create speed and power. Okay, so let's get into the actual dynamic here. Whoops. Let's get into the actual PST. Now, again, there is a lot of variation here. There's a lot of things that we can do with respect to the PST. I just put out a very simple couple exercises that are going to be really critical and that can become a foundation for moving forward into more complex stuff. So really, the biggest issue with respect to core mechanics in this overall scheme of things boils down to the deceleration component of the pelvis. So decelerating the pelvis with respect to the upper thoracic or upper torso, and creating what I would refer to as an intersegmental acceleration-deceleration pattern. So the deceleration of the pelvis, or the stabilization of the pelvis to allow thoracic or upper torso acceleration, is probably the #1 breakdown, and it really should be the #1 focus for all of these programs. Now, before I turn on my camera here and we start getting into the actual exercises, which are fairly simplistic, but if you try them, you'll see that they are fairly difficult to perform at first, and you'll see what we're talking about in terms of all these components coming together. But before I do that, let's talk just a little bit about progression. We talked about it last week as well. And so we want to have structure. Okay, so we have the structure. We also want to have progression. Progression can be increased intensity in a multitude of areas and in a multitude of ways. But the simplest way I have found, especially when you're starting with somebody, and remember, this isn't just for amateur athletes or your junior or low-level athletes. This is for pro athletes as well, high-level athletes. When you're first starting these programs, as athletic and gifted as a pro athlete might be, when you start to change pattern, you're introducing what I would refer to as novel movement, novel pattern, something they are not doing. They're not doing it. That's why we're trying to get them to do it. When you introduce a novel pattern, no matter how athletic somebody is, whatever level they are still starting slowly. When you do that, progressions, I have found, are best when they are intensified through very basic movements by adding volume, rather than increasing the complexity or the speed early on to increase intensity, or resistance to increase intensity, or things like that. It's easier to keep the program simple so that they're developing patterns systematically, and to challenge the nervous system, increase intensity by just increasing volume. And that's a very simple way that we can increase intensity, stimulate the nervous system, and get the results we want without compromising the movement pattern part of this. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and turn on my camera at this point, and I'm going to turn on the other camera